Hello and welcome to Season 5, Episode 5 of Conservation Conversations with BirdLife South Africa. I'm your host, Christina Hagen, coming to you live from Cape Town. We recently had our 150th episode, so we have over 150 episodes recorded and available on YouTube. So if you miss out because of load shedding or your Tuesday nights have become busy, you can always catch up later. Tonight, Crispian Olver is joining us from the Presidential Climate Commission, speaking about navigating the climate transition. And so we really look forward to that in just a few minutes. Crispian is the Executive Director of the Presidential Climate Commission, which is an independent multi-stakeholder advisory body established by the President of South Africa. He's served in the South African government in various capacities, including as the Director General of the Department of Environmental Affairs and Tourism, where he crafted much of the climate policy and environmental legislation, as well as leading South Africa's hosting of the World Summit on Sustainable Development in 2002. He has a deep interest in local governance issues and has published 2 books on the mechanics by which regimes are governed and the way in which good governance can be eroded. Crispian is actually a medical doctor by training, but it seems you have pivoted into the policy space, so I'm very interested to hear about how that happened. But Crispian, we're delighted to have you on the show and very much look forward to what you have to say. So you are welcome to now share your presentation and take it away.
Good. Thank you, Christina, and a very good evening, everyone. Thank you for the invitation to talk to BirdLife South Africa. I've followed a number of your presentations before, so you play a very important public educational role, and well done for having got to such a milestone with your webinars.
Thank you.
So I'm going to talk to you about the climate transition. So this is the start of the presentation, and what you're looking at obviously is a picture of the Earth's atmosphere from a low orbit satellite. And I think what you could say is that we're looking at a crime scene, because it's in this narrow film of gases surrounding our planet that we're dealing with the consequences of centuries of emissions, industrial emissions, combustion emissions, which have fundamentally altered the Earth's climate system. And I'm going to explore a little bit about what's going on and what we know about it. And there's quite a bit we don't know about it. And then I'm going to flip and try and talk about solutions. So the first half of the presentation is probably going to depress you terribly. And I hope the second half is going to give you some hope and some ideas of what we can do. But let me say a word first about the body I work for. So we're a multi-stakeholder commission. We were appointed by the president in December 2020. And our job is to provide independent, science-based advice on the transition to net zero. So in other words, how we cut emissions in our economy, and also how at the same time we build climate resilience. So we do 3 simple things. We talk to stakeholders, we engage the science, and we talk to scientists across the world, all the South African universities, and then we make recommendations. We give advice back to government, to cabinet, to the president, and to society at large. And sometimes what we have to say is accepted, and sometimes people don't like what we say, but we say it nevertheless. That's our job. So I'm going to start by talking about the climate anomaly. And when we discuss climate change, we're comparing temperature rise primarily against the pre-industrial average. So what were the average global temperatures before the industrial era, during which we started to put major emissions up into the atmosphere? And this just shows you the mean annual temperature deviation from the pre-industrial average. And you can see that for most of the last century, we were fluctuating below the average, and then we got roughly to the average. And then towards the end of the century and into the early 2000s, we started to exceed the average very rapidly and quite dramatically. And I'm going to give you just a little bit more granularity on that. So this is an image from the Financial Times that they do incredible imagery on climate issues. And you can see for each of the decades, so, you know, the 1980s, the 1990s, the 2000s, 2010s, and 2020s, you can see the annual mean temperature. This is measured at 2 meters above the ground. And you can see how each decade that mean temperature is rising. And, you know, in the 2000s, we were just below 1 degree centigrade. In the 2010s, we were above 1 and occasionally breaching 1.5. And now in the 2020s, you know, it looks like on current trend, we're breaching the 1.5 degree threshold. And, you know, just to say that the average temperature for February 2024 was 1.77 degrees higher than the 1850 to 1900 February average. Now, a lot of people have been saying, okay, well, we've already breached the Paris goal of 1.5 degrees. Not exactly. We measure the Paris goal as the average over the last 20 years. So, in fact, we're only going to know that we've definitively breached the 1.5 degree threshold in retrospect. And we're also, there's a slight multi-year variation triggered by the El Nino, La Nina cycle. And I just want to show you, this is another FD derivation of data from NOAA. And it just shows you how global mean temperatures fluctuate between El Nino and La Nina years. And, you know, the El Nino years, basically what's happening is that there's a shift of temperature between the ocean and the atmosphere. And in El Nino years, a lot of the, because a lot of global warming is being absorbed into the oceans. But so small fluctuations in temperature from ocean into atmosphere cause much higher land-based temperatures. So we are in an El Nino cycle, which is partly why we're seeing such high temperatures at the moment. And we'll need to have a little bit more distance to be able to tell when exactly we're going to breach 1.5 degrees. I mean, I would say it's almost certainly going to happen within the next decade. So that is a danger point for us. And just to show you, I mean, that this warming atmosphere has a number of knock-on effects, and it, you know, has knock-on effects in terms of precipitation, high precipitation in some areas, very low precipitation extending into droughts in other areas. It also, because there's more energy being pushed into the atmosphere, causes much more extreme weather events. So cyclones, tornadoes, high winds, and then, ancillary effects, so forest fires, catastrophic heat waves, ocean acidification. So there's a whole string of things that happen. This is just showing you what happens in terms of precipitation. And the 4 blocks show 1.5 degree global warming, 2 degree global warming, 3 degrees and 4 degrees. And it's a little bit difficult to see, but we're there at the southern tip of Africa. So if you're in the Sahara, it's going to be great news, because the Sahara is going to have a lot more precipitation than usual. Also, India, Pakistan, some of the Gulf states are going to do well out of it. But we are particularly prone to drying and high temperatures on the West and Southern Cape. And partly what's happening is that the weather systems are being pushed further south. So a lot of the cold fronts that bring rain into the Western Cape and the Southern Cape in the winter periods are now actually bypassing the coastline. And that's producing very pronounced drying in those parts. And you've already seen that playing out, for instance, in Cape Town with their day zero problem. And this is just another diagram showing you extreme weather events and their frequency and their economic impact. And it's the top 10 disasters, both by reported economic losses and by deaths. And the alarming thing is, if it's tracking it from 1970, and you can see both the rapid increase in economic effects and in frequency of weather events as we go, towards the right-hand side of the graph. The good news is that we're getting better at evacuations and disaster response. So in fact, there's been quite a dramatic decline in the number of deaths associated with these events. But it's causing major consternation, particularly in the insurance industry. So Lloyd's of London, who, a global reinsurer, estimate that over the next 5 years, there are going to be $5 trillion in losses from extreme weather events. So, you can start to see the real impact, including in financial terms, of the changing weather systems. And the more alarming part of this is what is referred to in the sort of climate community as tipping points. And tipping points are when you get long-term, irreversible, and self-perpetuating changes to planetary systems. And, you've probably heard a number of them before. So, the collapse of the Greenland ice sheet, or in Antarctica, which is a lot closer to us, the West Antarctica ice sheet. And in fact, the diagram on the right shows you the extent to which Antarctic sea ice is already being lost. So this is January, and it's looked at the mean levels of ice for January in the period 1981 to 2010. So you can already see how rapidly the January ice cover has shrunk compared to the historical norm. There are other tipping points. So, what happens to the permafrost when it thaws and releases all of that methane into the atmosphere? We're also hearing stories now around Amazon forest dieback. And the big thing that worries scientists is a change in the ocean circulation. So what we refer to as the Atlantic meridional overturning current, which circulates water throughout the Atlantic area. So, tipping points are what really frightens us, and beyond 1.5 degrees of global warming, we're going to start reaching these tipping points. And that's of particular concern. And it's of concern broadly to decision makers. And every year, there's this meeting of the world's business leaders at Davos. And in the build-up to the Davos event, they release their risk perception survey. And this is a survey that's done across all business leaders, government, senior government people, academics, civil society leaders. And they surveying people about their perception of risks. And they ask, what is the likely impact measured as severity of the following risks? And they do it for a 2-year horizon and a 10-year horizon. And interestingly, so the 2-year horizon is quite a mixed bag of stuff. Misinformation and disinformation is number one. It's something we confront almost on a weekly basis in the climate space. Extreme weather events listed as number 2. Societal polarization, cyber insecurity, interstate armed conflict. You can go down the list. 10 years, the 10-year horizon, the top 4 risks there are all environmental risks. So extreme weather events, critical change to Earth systems, biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse, natural resource shortages. So it's really interesting that these are people that have the power, and many of these leaders are actively contributing to the climate crisis because they run large companies that are in charge of these emissions. But of the top risks that they're seeing environmental damage and consequences as the major risks to focus on. And these risks, of course, are all linked. And this is a sort of a risk map of all of those risks. And I know it's a slightly complicated graph, but if you look at the top left-hand side, in fact, I think I've got I can get a pointer, laser pointer. So up here in the top left-hand side are the cluster of environmental risks: natural resource shortages, extreme weather events, critical change to Earth systems, biodiversity loss. But then look at how they link to other risks: involuntary migration, chronic health conditions, infectious diseases, because changing climate's going to affect like a whole lot of tropical diseases, cholera, etc. And then these link to other things, disruption to critical infrastructure, disruptions to supply chains, economic downturns, societal polarization, interstate violence. So, you can see these climate and environmental risks meshing into a sort of much broader global risk profile. So that is of particular concern as we, think we can't just think about climate risks on their own. We need to think about them in relation to a whole range of other risks that might be unfolding. So how do we get on top of the problem? And I want to now start talking about mitigation. It's, is in the climate space this term mitigation, which is basically about how do we cut emissions to bring us within a safe operating area. And all of the world scientists agree that to basically bring ourselves within a manageable level of risk, so to keep global warming below 2 degrees, preferably to 1.5 degrees, we need to get global emissions to net zero by 2050. And that is the target that, you know, the UNFCCC, the world's climate body, is working towards. And this graph on the left shows you the total global emissions per annum, and the trajectory before the Paris Agreement, you know, showed a steadily rising amount of CO2 emissions. And then the diagram on the right shows you what the expected impact of that is. So if we stayed with the pre-Paris baseline, business as usual, global temperatures would, by 2100, that's the year that we're working towards. I know it's a little bit far ahead. Most of us will not be around then, but we need to think in terms of centuries, planning on the scale. Business as usual, we would end up between 3 and 5 degrees of global warming. And that'll have catastrophic effects. If you look at stated policy, so these are policies that governments have put into law and which they're implementing. Those will bring us to a range of between 2 and 3.5 degrees. If you look at the announced pledges, so now the announced pledges are a little bit more abstract. It includes, for instance, some countries will have signed onto certain policies, but they'll also say, we're aiming to get to, you know, X or amount, but it's not yet in law. The policies are not yet giving effect to it. That'll get us closer. And then net zero is where we need to be. And that'll give us a range. We don't really know, but we estimate it'll lead to global warming of between 1 and 2 degrees centigrade. And that's what we're pushing towards. But that has very profound implications. And I just want to show you what it means, for instance, in the energy sector. And I'm putting energy on the table because it's the area, the single greatest area in terms of the source of emissions. And if you just look at the diagram on the right, which is the net zero. So this is comparing announced pledges and net zero. And the diagram on the right shows, you know, currently our systems are dependent, highly dependent on coal, burning coal, oil, particularly for the internal combustion engine and shipping, natural gas, some nuclear. And then, you know, here's biomass, hydro, bioenergy, wind and solar. And this just projects out to 2030, 2040 and 2050 what the changes are going to have to be in these technologies. And there were, you know, this is data from the International Energy Association, so they are a little bit more gung-ho. They think there'll be some carbon capture and storage that'll allow some of these fossil fuel technologies to persist. But even the IEA is saying massive increases in solar, in wind, modern bioenergy. I mean, this is what future energy systems are going to come to depend on. And we're looking at a transition that's really bookended by two things. I mean, there's coal demand, which is going to fall off a cliff, even if you're just going according to stated policies and announced pledges and renewables, which is on the sort of hockey stick of a massive increase. And this leads us to, debates around the pace at which this transition is conducted in. And it's a very active debate in South Africa. And, there's some people that think we need a slower transition, partly because in their view, variable renewable energy systems are not secure. The economic cost of coal closure on jobs is too high. And once you factor in all the ancillary services like battery storage and peaking plants, renewables aren't competitive. Those that advocate a faster transition, which I'd include myself amongst, see the benefits of enhanced trade and jobs, reduced impacts from climate change, health co-benefits, for instance, air pollution as we start to cut emissions, and enhanced access to capital. And the reason I'm, an advocate for a faster transition is because of what I think is going to happen to our trading systems. And that's because the carbon intensity of our economy, if you look on the diagram on the left, is much higher than any of our competitor countries in trading terms. So South Africa's actually got amongst the highest carbon intensity in the world, much higher, for instance, than India or China, which have got a little bit more latitude in terms of the climate policies that they're pursuing. And, you would have probably followed in the news these trade restrictions that the EU are bringing in. It's called the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. It's basically factoring in the price of our emissions into the products that we export into the EU. And they're going to phase it in over a decade. So by 2034, there'll be a 100% phase in of those costs. And that's going to seriously affect our trade into the EU. We've done some numbers which show that, iron and steel, aluminium, chemicals are all going to be particularly affected. Cement and fertilizers are also at risk, although we don't export that much to the EU. But if you look at jobs, it's got major implications. So, there's a lot of talk about coal mining and the 80,000 employees there. But I'm particularly worried about the steel sector and the 190,000 jobs in the steel sector. Aluminium with some 12,000 jobs. Chemicals with 167,000. Auto manufacturing with 100,000 and cement with 35,000. So, these are big industrial sectors. And if we're squeezed out of the global trading system, we're going to stand to have our economy very severely damaged. And it's not just the EU that's looking at these policies. I mean, Canada, Australia, the UK are all exploring their own kinds of carbon border adjustment. I realize I'm running out of time and I'm going to skip through some of these slides, but I think, Christina, I'm presuming you can circulate the presentation or put it up on the website later so that people can have a look at it. So we've done some projections of what is an economically and financially and technically feasible pathway to net zero. And we've translated that in the energy sector. So this is South Africa's power generation by technology. Here is coal. We think the right thing to do would be to basically phase out coal, except for a small residual amount by 2040. The big increase is in solar and wind. We've got incredible solar and wind resources. And our modeling shows that balancing that with co-located battery storage and some peaking power from gas would allow you to have a renewable dominant energy system. Equally, in terms of public transport, that's our second highest emission sector. We need to move rapidly from the internal combustion engine, so these are cars and motorbikes, to electric vehicles. That's this pale green block. And then in terms of bus and minibus, also migrate into electric with some rail. So, these are big transitions. And we think this transition's got to happen faster than any of the other modeling has shown. So, our auto production, we export 2/3 of our cars, and 2/3 of those go to Europe. And Europe is phasing out the internal combustion engine by 2035. So we're going to have to transition much more rapidly to sustain our auto manufacturing sector over time. All of this is going to have major effects in terms of employment. And we've done some modeling. I mean, this is looking from 2020 out to 2050. What are the shifts in employment? And they're obviously going to be losses in some sectors, which is in the red, direct and indirect losses. But the sectors that are going to grow, and in particular renewables, batteries, green hydrogen, minerals for the future green economy, fuel cells and electrolyzers, a lot of those sectors are going to more than offset the job losses that we're anticipating. This just shows you the breakdown of losses and gains by sector. So, obviously losses in coal, petroleum, chemicals, but significant gains, particularly around hydrogen, other metal ores and platinum, which is going to be needed for the electrolyzers and to make green hydrogen. A lot of those losses are going to be concentrated here in Mpumalanga. These gray dots are where all of the coal mining is taking place. A lot of South Africa's, oddly enough, we're going to do, the mining sector as a whole is going to do well out of the transition, because we do have a lot of the other minerals that are needed for the future green economy, including platinum, copper, chrome, lead, manganese, nickel, vanadium. And these are more, centrifugally located around the country. So there will be mining jobs, but they're going to be in very different parts of the country. And that's why we talk about trying to ensure a just transition. And, the idea of a just transition is to make sure that we're proactively building out new economic sectors and jobs in those sectors. And we talk about three broad areas of intervention around the just transition. So there's active labor market policies. So this is things like skills development, apprenticeships, reskilling workers that are shifting from one industry to another, putting employment incentives in place and internships, and ensuring that we're placing people actively in jobs. Then there's industrial policy, which is really about ensuring the infrastructure and logistics and incentives are in place for renewables and battery manufacturing, EVs, green hydrogen, and critical minerals. And that we're, being proactive about localizing supply chains. And then lastly, we do need to talk about social support. So this is income support for displaced workers, particularly as they're transitioning into new jobs, and early retirement for older workers. And we also talk about access to basic services, healthcare, and housing. So those are the sort of planks of what we mean when we talk about a just transition. We've done some modeling around the investment requirements, and just broadly, there's the costs of decarbonization, there's the costs of adaptation, particularly food security and built environment, infrastructure resilience, water security. And then there are the costs of the just transition, which I've just been talking about. And we've calculated these costs out to 2030 and to 2050. And they're big numbers. We need about R1 billion to decarbonize up to 2030. We need just over 4 trillion by 2050. And if you look at the total costs of the climate transition, we estimate them in the region of R8.5 trillion by 2050, a giant number. What the work we do at the Commission, amongst many things, we track the flows of climate finance. And I know this is a very complicated diagram. It's a little bit messy. But basically, we're looking at all of the financial flows from sources. So these are commercial banks, DFIs, institutional investors, corporations, government, bilateral DFIs, multilateral DFIs. Then the instruments, debt, equity, budget expenditure, grants. The uses, mitigation obviously dominating. Some dual benefits, some adaptation, not nearly enough, and then the end-use sectors. And, predictably, clean energy getting a lot of it, some going into energy efficiency, too little into agriculture, forestry, water, climate smart agriculture, and crops and buildings. But we work off a broad strategy, which is, how do we mobilize domestic savings? How do we tap into capital markets? How do we get more out of the very constrained government budget? What can development partners bring? So, we've been engaging the G7. We've launched this Just Energy Transition Partnership, the famous $7.5 billion that we've raised, which is now $12.5 billion. And then some philanthropic capital, which we're using for some of the more softer issues, such as skills and institutional capacity. So that's just a few headline issues on money. So to close, this is my last slide. We're talking about 3 interrelated transitions, and I've tried to sort of sketch them. So there's the decarbonization journey. How do we cut emissions? There's the adaptation journey. So how do we respond to a rapidly changing climate and build our resilience to the physical effects of climate change? And then the just transition elements. And, just broadly, conceptually, we're trying to move from where we are now. We're highly vulnerable to climate change. We've got a very inefficient, low productivity and very carbon intensive economy. We've got a very weak public sector with very poor implementation capacity. We've got high levels of poverty and inequality, decreasing per capita income. But we do have a very active civil society and a strong social base for the just transition. And, amongst other things, the BirdLife community is part of that active civil society. And, if we can just talk a little bit of blue sky, where do we want to be by 2050? We want an economy and society that are resilient to climate risks. We want to have successfully got our economy to net zero emissions. So a point at which all the residual emissions we're emitting are being captured and offset. either mechanically through carbon capture and storage or through natural sinks. We want to be growing investment. We want a competitive economy with an effective and enabling state, and dramatically reduce levels of poverty, inequality, and unemployment, and social inclusion, so that we can say we've reached a just transition. So I'm going to leave it at that point. If you're wanting to drill into more information, you can go to our website, which has got all of our reports and studies on it, www.climatecommission.org.za. And I'm not great on most social media platforms except Twitter, or what's now called X. And you can follow me on Twitter at Crispian Olver. I post quite regularly and I make various controversial comments. So that is it from my side. And I'd be very, I see we do have some time left. I'm sorry, I went a little bit over time, Christina.
No, that's fine.
And happy to answer any questions or respond to any comments.
Thanks. Yeah, that was a great presentation that really kind of simplified a very complex issue. So thank you for that. And as you said, providing a bit of hope towards the end of the presentation, not just all doom and gloom, which I think is necessary. So yes, there are a few questions coming in, and I just want to remind people to please put your questions in the Q&A feed rather than the comment box, as it's more difficult for me to monitor the comment feed because there are lots of messages coming in there. So please, if you have asked a question in the chat box, please just put it in the Q&A box. So we'll start with a question from Susan Goldstein. And I think she put this in when you were on the slide looking at the different transport sectors. And she's asked, why is rail such a small part of the transition?
So rail is a very important part of the equation, but it's not the primary way of moving people around. So, you know, the big shift is exiting the internal combustion engine and moving on to what are referred to as new energy vehicles. Mm-hmm. And new energy vehicles could be electric, or they could be powered by things such as green hydrogen. You know, South Africa's unfortunately got a historic form of urban structure, which is very dispersed. We should be, I broadly agree with the point, we should be as a country making much more use of rail, because, you know, if once you've moved all of your rail onto electric and you've got your energy system relying predominantly on renewables and battery storage, then, you know, theoretically rail is carbon neutral. But yeah, the bulk of the reduction in emissions is going to come from moving away from the internal combustion engine. In terms of the causes, I mean, and I'm seeing this question about population growth.
Yeah, don't worry about looking through the Q&A. I'll manage that, unless you see something you specifically want to answer. But maybe since you've raised it, if you would like to address it, that would be great. Just for the viewers who can't see the questions, the question is from Jack, asking about what Jack calls the cause of the problem not being brought into the discussion, and that being human population growth.
Yeah, I mean, it's ultimately the economy and the emissions that are required to produce a unit of gross domestic product. Obviously, the economy is linked to people. I mean, the economy runs on people, and a lot of the drivers in the economy are consumption driven. So you can make the argument. I mean, there's a very small percentage of the Earth's population that consume the bulk of the products that are produced. And if you're wanting to link emissions directly to population, then it's that small segment of high consumers that I don't have the number, but I mean, it's by like multiple orders of magnitude higher than low income consumers. So it's not population per se, it's rather the consumption habits of a small global elite that are principally behind the drivers of climate change. So yes, there is a link to population, but it's not exactly what you think.
That's a great answer. Thank you. As you say, it's all about the consumption of those people. So a couple of questions have come in, one Thomas and Margie Mills, and then Christo Venter, kind of similar themes, asking about the ratio between human-induced carbon release versus natural or environmental release.
Yeah, I mean, the primary driver of climate change is what we call anthropogenic. So it's human-induced emissions. There is, there obviously is an effect on climate regulation from some natural phenomena. And you're getting me a little bit beyond my comfort zone in discussing volcanoes, if that is the question. As I understand it, volcanoes have slightly contradictory effects. So they do emit some greenhouse gases, but by far the greater effect is from the dust cloud that they create, which actually has a cooling effect, not a warming effect. But exactly what those numbers are, I don't have at my fingertips. The primary driver, I mean, the world scientists are universally agreed, except for one or two complete wackos. But everyone that subscribes to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the world's leading scientific authority on this, the primary overwhelming driver is human-induced climate change.
Yeah, absolutely. So Leslie Cornish is asking about the materials needed for batteries and the additional impact that places on the environment. So let me just read it. What about supplying the materials needed for batteries? They are not being produced in high enough amounts and in not good place, in I guess bad places to mine. Do you have any insights on that?
So I think you're raising a valid point, which is that in the drive to get to net zero, we are going to have to, based on the technologies that we have at our disposal that are commercially proven, so solar PV, wind, battery storage, and peaking power. I mean, that's basically the combination except in places that have got good hydro, and except if you're wanting to go the nuclear route, which I'm not a particular advocate for, but some people do advocate it, and it is, other than the massive construction up front, it is a low carbon solution in terms of its long-term operations. So all of what I've mentioned is these technologies are very minerals intensive. I mean, we should not beat about the bush. They are more mineral intensive than fossil fuel technologies. And the demand for many of those minerals, what are referred to as critical minerals or minerals for the green economy, are going to go through the roof. They are going to expand dramatically. And that includes lithium and vanadium. It includes, nickel, cobalt, manganese, copper, aluminium, lead. And all of those have environmental impacts. I mean, we cannot deny that. And if there was a way of mitigating them, we would need to, but we're facing a climate catastrophe. So, I mean, this is a very good subject. I mean, there are ways of minimizing the impact. One of them, for instance, is to do a lot more on recycling of materials. So to make sure that the critical minerals that we've now injected into the system are being constantly reused rather than going out and mining them afresh. But I can't stand here in front of you and say that this transition is not going to have environmental consequences. It will.
Yeah, absolutely. It's, I guess, about making the best decisions that we can with the information we have available, and looking at the risks of each option, I suppose. So you mentioned nuclear just now, and Leslie's asked another question about, or saying, why has nuclear disappeared? So does nuclear have a role to play in the transition? Or what are your thoughts?
So let me, I flipped through that one slide, and maybe I could just bring it up.
Yeah,
so
sure.
This is Eskom's calculations. And now I've gone back to the, sorry, I'm now having to flip through all the
That's
slides.
okay.
There we are. So this is now a little bit out of date. So some of these cost numbers have adjusted, but this was Eskom's assessment of the different generation technologies, ranging from PV, wind, gas, nuclear, and new coal. And they were, the way to compare costs is this, what we call the LCOE, the levelized cost of electricity. So you factor both capital and operating costs in over the life of the plant, and then you work out a price in terms of cents. These are US cents per kilowatt hour. And you can see that solar is 4.2 cents, wind 5.4, gas 7.3, although in fact, this is a highly uncertain price, because if you're importing liquefied natural gas at current prices, you're going to be paying higher. Nuclear is 19.8 cents. And new coal, so this would be coal with the bells and whistles, but without carbon capture, 15.9, 16 cents per kilowatt hour. So you can see the massive difference in terms of price. Also, there's, on nuclear, there's a very long build time, 12 to 15 years. Whereas these other technologies, we can get to market within, a couple of years.
Yeah.
So, sure. If you put aside the nuclear safety issue, which is, the one big argument that's raised against nuclear, and some people like the French put up a very strong argument that you can manage the safety risk. You of course are left with the storage problem, so you've got to store the nuclear waste for centuries in a geologically, tectonically stable environment. So you need to make sure that there's going to be no disruption. You basically stick it at the bottom of a mine shaft, but you're passing that on for future generations. So, these are things you've got to think about. But the big issue with nuclear is cost. And by far the least cost power system would be renewables, batteries, and some gas, only at low utilizations for peaking purposes. So you can use gas for baseload if you've got lots of your own gas and you're not paying exorbitant LNG prices. Some countries do use it for baseload generation. It would be catastrophically unaffordable for us. But we do see a role in the medium term for gas-fired peaking plant to balance a renewable dominant grid. Longer term, you can convert those gas peakers onto green hydrogen once that technology comes into play. So we would see a limited role for gas over a 20-year period to balance a renewable dominant grid. That archetype, it's what we call a renewables dominant archetype, is way cheaper than a nuclear archetype. So I would argue against nuclear on the question of cost, but to me, every technology's got a little bit of upside and a bit of downside. So some energy planners argue that you need to, energy security depends on diversity. So there could be the basis to put another nuclear power station into the mix in South Africa, like another Coburg type nuclear power station. One is not going to break the bank. I wouldn't die in the ditch if the DMRE put one more nuke into the mix. But what we don't want to do is pull back on an aggressive rollout of renewable energy, which is what we need to really take us out of the load shedding milieu that we're in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I hadn't realized quite how long the lead times were. So the renewables can be up and running, which if we need to transition, which we do, is also going to be a factor. We need to do it now, not in 15 years time.
Yeah.
So there's been a couple of questions. So there's still quite a few questions in the chat box or in the Q&A box, and more are coming in.
Well, far away. Let's see how far we can get before you close.
So I don't think we will get to all of them, but if we don't, would you be okay with me sending them to you, and you can perhaps get back to some of the people asking them?
Sure.
Great. So a couple of people, I've lost the exact wording, but they were basically asking about the kind of implementation of the plans and ideas that you've presented now. What are your thoughts on that, and how hopeful are you that things will be implemented well and timelessly?
Do you want a blunt answer?
Sure.
I mean, look, we are dealing with a state that has been absolutely hollowed out through a decade of state capture and corruption, and in which the central, the central ability of any state, you've got to have a vision of the future, know where you're going, and you need to lead and make decisions along that path. And at the moment, the way the ruling party is embedded into the state at the moment, you've got all sorts of competing factions and tendencies and an inability to make coherent political decisions. And we see this particularly play out, for instance, in the energy sector. So, we all know what needs to be done in terms of addressing the immediate energy shortages, but no sooner have we embarked down that path than some smart minister, of whatever, a minister of electricity, a minister for mineral resources and energy, some other minister for planning and monitoring and evaluation, says something different. And then all the civil servants get anxious because they've now heard a different political message, and then they get paralyzed and they don't act. So, make no mistake, we're dealing with some very serious implementation challenges. A lot of what we do as the Climate Commission, I mean, we're just advisory. So I have no ability to go out there and, instruct someone to do something. But we do spend an enormous amount of our time engaging with all these disparate parts of the government and engaging with more broadly the different stakeholders out there, the unions, the miners, the other business people, the industrialists, and trying to herd them towards a consensus view. And our theory of change is that if we can build consensus around a minimum set of actions, then things can move forward. So that's what I work on every day. I get up and I go out and I look for where the biggest incoherence points are, and then we work on trying to build some sort of minimum program of action around it. So I'm very mindful that, this is slow, it's painstaking, but it's necessary.
Yeah, thanks for your honesty and bluntness in addressing some very real issues. And yeah, we wish you the best of luck in herding the cats towards this transition. Yeah, I'm just looking through the many questions. From Ian is asking about the EU penalties and whether this will just divert exports or imports from China, as is happening all over Southern Africa. So I guess the question is, will the markets shift to going to China rather than importing from South Africa?
I'm not clear whether that's meaning our exports or China's exports. I mean, we stand. What I think is going to happen, I mean, my anxiety about the global trading system is that I think it's going to bifurcate. So you're going to have EU, Canada, US, Australia, New Zealand, all cohering around basically factoring a carbon price into the global trading system. Mm-hmm. And then you're going to have a set of rogue states that refuse to do so. and that will include Russia, China, and a basket of dictatorial regimes. And I guess we can put our eggs in that basket. I mean, we certainly have done that before around, on various issues. But I think it's a short-term and ultimately unproductive route. And, make no mistake, there's a lot of talk about global solidarity between developing countries. I can assure you, this is a naked competition for who dominates the supply chains in the new energy economy. And none of these people are our friends. What China's been systematically doing is building a highly dominant position around EVs, renewable energy, green hydrogen technologies, EV manufacture and batteries, and securing all of the supply chains and critical minerals that support that. And they're in a highly dominant position with most of them. I mean, they're, 80% of the world's productive capacity for EVs and solar panels is now in China's hands. And when China's eventually going to move, they've said they're going to get to net zero by 2060, a little bit later than what the scientists say to us. The Chinese are serious. When they say they're going to do something, they don't just, like South Africans, set a target and then hope that it comes by. They methodically work their way to achieve that target. And as China shifts, that whole market, they're going to suddenly move into a different kind of trading bloc. And they themselves will start implementing their own carbon border adjustment mechanisms. So, South African politicians that stand there and shout and scream and say we're going to burn coal forever and no one's going to tell us how to run our economy. I'm afraid they're playing Russian roulette with the South African economy and South African workers, and will lead us into a dead end economically. We'll be, a defunct economy relying on a set of outdated technologies and shut out of global trading and financial systems.
Yeah, that's quite a sobering answer there, and yeah, hopefully the message gets through to the people that it needs to get through to. Are you happy to keep going? I'm also just keeping an eye on the participants. We still have quite a few people with us, so if you're happy to keep going, we can go through it.
Maybe let's do one more. Let's do one more question.
Okay,
and then you can mail the rest to me.
Okay, and actually, just before we lose more people, you said you would be happy for me to share your presentation with the viewers.
Sure.
Okay. Yeah, so if you would like a copy of the presentation, please just drop an email to conversations@birdlife.org.za. I put it in the chat earlier, but I'll just do that again. Conversations@birdlife.org.za. Okay. Have you seen a question that you would like to answer? Otherwise, I have one that I just need to find again. Where did it go?
The most controversial one.
The most controversial one. Okay. Ooh, they're
just
all,
to keep it interesting.
Often a lot of them are quite controversial. I don't know if it's controversial, but there's one question about from Anne about carbon emissions from the current wars. Do you have any opinions or knowledge about that? Do you know if anyone's looking at that?
I saw some articles around the environmental impact of the Ukraine war. I mean, I don't think the war is a driver of emissions principally through armaments production. I don't think the actual firing of missiles is a significant contributor to climate change. But certainly the iron and steel that go into armaments production is a major producer of emissions and consumer of coal and coking coal. I mean, it's an integral part of the steel making process. But, you know, that is, you know, part of aggregate industrial production. There are many drivers behind industrial production. War and global conflict is certainly one of the drivers, but there are many others. I mean, we talked earlier about the consumption of you know, high-income people, a big driver.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not like the armaments can be reused once they've been fired off. So it, yeah, I guess is a constant production required. Yeah, okay, so I think we'll leave it there. On maybe not the best note to leave it on, but yes, thank you very much, Crispian, for an eye-opening presentation. And as I said, you distilled very complex information into something that was easily understandable. So thank you very much for that. Before we go, I'd just like to remind everyone that we'll be back in 2 weeks' time with another episode of Conservation Conversations, and we'll be joined by Ben Murphy, who will be presenting about fork-tailed drongos and how they are coping with the increasing temperatures. So again, a bit linked to climate change. Yeah, so how the drongos are coping with hotter temperatures. So please do join us in 2 weeks' time for that. So thank you very much, Crispian, again for joining us, and thank you very much to the viewers. I don't know if you have any last words you'd like to share with us before I let you go.
No, thank you for the invitation. It was great being able to engage with you, and I appreciate all the comments and questions. And yeah, good luck with your webinars going forward. These, as I said at the beginning, these are very important. I'm
glad you've been enjoying them, and we have a great lineup for the rest of the year. So please do tune in when you can. And yeah, thanks everyone again, and we'll see you in 2 weeks' time. Good night.